symptoms of virtue. Any extra questions about these? Yeah.
So I have a question about symptom 3, the virtuous choices. So how do I have access to a virtuous choice of another agent?
Of another agent.
Besides the action that they perform?
So you brought up earlier a question about whether or not all virtue signaling had to take the form of speech acts. And I think that gives us a nice little bridge into thinking about the ways in which we also have access, other ways we have access to people's choices. If they're trustworthy, they'll tell us. But if they're trying to be intentionally deceptive, you might have a problem, right? You might have a credibility problem. We're going to consider in just a second the fact that an observer, like you bring up, runs into several sorts of obstacles when trying to ascertain whether any of these symptoms has actually been expressed. Right? So suffice it to say, I think that if your antennae are out and you're very skeptical about whether or not anyone on the outside is going to have access to some of these features or symptoms, I think you're probably in majority company or something like that. Yeah.
I just had a question on kind of the difference between 1 and 3, because to make a virtuous action, to take virtuous action, do you not have to make a virtuous choice first, or does choice refer more to like your intentions, maybe?
Mm-hmm. This is a kind of tricky issue in a lot of the Aristotelian scholarship. So you've glommed onto a correct kind of like a puzzle, right? I think it's Aristotle's view that sometimes choice can come apart from action. You get examples in other texts of people who are prevented or interrupted from acting, even though they were meaning to or something like that. But the question of whether there's anything like the contemporary idea of intention or will or anything lurking in Aristotle is a contentious one. Some people think that there is a theory of the will in Aristotle, and some sort of identifiable process of willing or something like that. Other people think that there are all kinds of different faculties within the soul for Aristotle that when they combine their forces give us what we conceive of as willing today. But again, a long answer to a short question. I think that Aristotle, in at least very few cases, would say that choice is capable of being separated from action. And that might align with our modern sensibilities, right? I make choices all the time that I don't follow through on. Maybe it makes me feel better about myself if I make the correct choice. But if I don't follow through on it, does that mean I'm virtue signaling? I mean these are questions that we're going to consider just shortly. So I think you clued into a pretty interesting question and puzzle just in general about Aristotelian ethics. Yeah.
So the pleasure or whatever the corresponding emotional component is to a virtuous action, once the virtue has been perfected, that emotional aspect has to be motivating, right? Like it can't be, like when you're cultivating the virtue, the emotional aspect can be post facto.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're actually virtuous, like it's the emotional component that motivates it, right?
I think that's right. I think there's a complicated story about desire for Aristotle being the origin of all animal motion, right? And so to a certain extent, there's something definitively emotional about desiring things, right? Or longing after them or something like that. So if I tracked your question correctly, yes is the answer, but it should also be pointed out that the rational aspect of the motivation, at least according to Aristotle, it gets described as in parallel with the emotional motivation. So the question of priority in terms of time is going to be different from the question of priority in terms of maybe other features like developmental priority or something like that within the agent's soul. But that's a super, super complicated question that I'm not 100% sure I've got the best answer for right now. But it's a good question nonetheless. Good. So 3 symptoms of virtue. mentioned just moments ago that an observer runs into obstacles with respect to all three. Right? The first symptom, the actual performance of a virtuous action, it's going to be difficult for an observer to sort of pick out. And you might wonder why. But if we think about some of the things that Aristotle thinks about virtue as a character type, right? Which leads to consistent virtuous action and behavior, something like that. So what's wrong with just, observer walking out to the forum or the agro one day and seeing somebody perform what looks like a genuinely brave action, and then concluding about that person that the person's brave? What's gone wrong in that evaluation? If virtue is supposed to be something consistent.
It's a hasty generalization.
Hasty generalization, and what would you need more, right?
You need more examples of this person doing the brave thing in the right time.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. One analogy that's super helpful when trying to tell the difference between character types and actions for Aristotle is thinking about the difference between an object's position on the one hand and its velocity on the other hand. In order to tell an object's velocity or its speed, you need at least 2 position points. You can't make a judgment just on the basis of one. I think you need more than 2 actions for Aristotle to tell whether somebody's virtuous, but the point should stand, I think, that there's a kind of similarity there, right? That one is a kind of measure of consistency with respect to actions over time, whereas an action is just a measure of a singular choice that's been enacted at any given moment or something like that. So that's the problem the observer faces in the first case, right? Unless you're a nanny or something is going to be following someone around all like month long and able to tell a bunch of different actions apart from one another, you're gonna have to be skeptical as an observer. Oh, I saw that one generous action, and it looks like you donated money to a homeless person. But I find out later that you were just practicing your coin flipping skills outside of the fountain and it landed in the homeless person's change cup, right? I'm probably not going to be able to trust my initial evaluation, right? No longer do I think you're generous or something like that. Good. What's wrong with the second one? Second symptom. If an observer walks up and sees somebody do something apparently virtuous, and is emphatic about taking pleasure in that action, what kind of obstacle might the observer run into in a case like that? Yeah.
The person taking the action could just be feigning the pleasure.
Right. Think of any examples that are particularly funny. I can think of the person who, like me, I try not to eat any donuts. I'm trying to exercise temperance until after today is over. Nevertheless, right, I don't think I'm a temperate person. Later on I'll probably eat lots of donuts. But, if I sit up here for the next 20 minutes and say, look how great I am, right, I love the fact that I'm not eating any donuts right now. It's my favorite part of today is the fact that I'm not consuming any tasty pastries. I'm feigning that pleasure in performing the virtuous action, refraining from indulging in the sweet things or something like that. There's a sort of pretense of pleasure possibility. I have no good reason for throwing possibility up there other than to save alliteration. But that's another obstacle the observer runs into. And we kind of touched on an obstacle the observer runs into with respect to the third symptom a little bit earlier. We said that, the real only access we have to another person's internal life of choice making or something like that is by asking them to report on the choices they've made. So liars, right?